Politics continues to accelerate. Suddenly, there's the glimpse, at least, of a possible deal. Frantic talks this weekend and for the next few days, the Queen's speech tomorrow, then the EU summit, then the first Saturday parliamentary sitting since the Falklands War. But any real change? Perhaps a Boris Johnson deal against the odds. But in a post-Brexit Britain, the very future of the UK as we've known it comes into play. This morning, we're at the Scottish National Party conference in Aberdeen. There are big changes ahead, and they may be starting here. I'm joined live this morning by Scotland's First Minister, the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon. And I'll be talking to Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, one of the Cabinet's leading Brexiteers, to find out what Boris Johnson can offer and what he can't. So where is Labour in all of this? Rebecca Long-Bailey is being widely touted as its post-Jeremy Corbyn leader. Is she delighted by that or embarrassed? Reviewing the news, Kate Proctor, political correspondent of The Guardian, the BBC's Sarah Smith, and Rachel Watson, deputy political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail. All of that coming up soon, but first the news with Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The wife of a US diplomat who was involved in a car crash that killed the British teenager Harry Dunn says she's been left devastated by the accident. Last night, the Foreign Office revealed that Anne Sakoulas no longer has diplomatic immunity because she's now back in the United States, while Harry's parents, who've been campaigning for her return to the UK, are due to fly to Washington later.
They've taken their fight for justice to the Foreign Office in London, and now Harry Dunn's parents are flying to the US. They say ever since Harry's death, they've been trapped in a nightmare. He was killed on this road, hit by a car believed to have been driven by Anne Sakoulas, the wife of a US diplomat. She returned home shortly afterwards, claiming diplomatic immunity. Now she's broken her silence. A statement issued through her lawyer said no loss compares to the death of a child. Anne would like to meet with Mr Dunn's parents so that she can express her deepest sympathies and apologies for this tragic accident. It's something Harry Dunn's family had been calling for.
You want to grieve. You desperately want to grieve. The whole family desperately want to grieve. But we can't. So every day is a battle. Every day is more of a battle than we feel it should be.
And in that battle, Harry's parents have now received a letter from the Foreign Secretary. Dominic Raab writes, the UK government's position is that immunity is no longer relevant in Mrs Sakoulas' case because she has returned home. The US have now informed us that they too consider that immunity is no longer pertinent. This could now pave the way for an attempt to extradite Mrs Sakoulas to the UK. Simon Jones, BBC News.
At least 18 people have been killed and dozens injured as Japan recovers from its biggest storm in decades. Typhoon Hagibis triggered floods and landslides as it battered the country with speeds of up to 140 miles an hour. Officials said some of those killed were swept away by landslides, whilst others were trapped in their cars as floodwaters rose. After making landfall yesterday, the storm flooded rivers and left nearly 500,000 homes without power. Our Tokyo correspondent, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, has the details.
It is now a bright, sunny day in Tokyo, with little evidence of the storm that swept across the city last night. But the vast amounts of rain dropped by Typhoon Hagibis has breached flood defences right across the country. The area affected stretches for over 1,000 kilometres, the equivalent of Cornwall to Edinburgh. In the town of Hakone near Mount Fuji, more than a metre of rain fell on Friday and Saturday, the highest 48-hour total ever recorded. Further north in Nagano Prefecture, levees along the Chikuma River have given way, and water is still rushing through residential areas, inundating houses up to the second floor. The levees around Tokyo have held, and river levels are now falling. The Japanese Grand Prix is going ahead, and for World Cup rugby fans, there is good news. The much-anticipated match between Scotland and host Japan will now take place tonight. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Tokyo.
Kurds who are under attack from Turkey in northern Syria say they will no longer prioritise guarding detainees from the Islamic State group if the offensive continues. Since hostilities began on Wednesday, nearly 50 civilians are thought to have died and more than 100,000 people fled their homes. The UK has called on Turkey to end its military operation in the area. The leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has warned Brexit supporters the government will have to make compromises to get a deal. His comments in the Sunday Telegraph come as Downing Street sources suggest the UK is still a long way from agreeing a deal with Brussels, and talks, they say, remain critical. Boris Johnson is due to meet the leaders of France and Germany in the coming days to try to secure their support. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. But Andrew, back to you in Aberdeen.
Many thanks, Ben. Well, here we are in sunny Aberdeenshire with the Scottish papers, or the Scottish editions of the papers as well. With me to review those are Kate Proctor, Sarah Smith and Rachel Watson. But first, as ever, the front pages. Here's the front page. This is the Sunday Times' Scottish edition, which you probably won't be able to see in England in that same way. And its main story at the top of the paper is a referendum poll showing that support for independence is now running at 50%, and more Scots would prefer to be in an independent Scotland inside the EU than stay with Brexit England. So that we'll talk about that in a moment. And their front page, their main front page splash story, the same everywhere, I'm sure. Sign this deal or let us go now, Boris tells EU. And that's about the frantic talks he's having with Barnier and the Irish and others over the next few days. The Observer there has a rather different take on what's going to happen over the next few days. The Observer's story is support grows for new Brexit poll. That's another referendum amid fears over the Prime Minister's plans. Elsewhere, it says that Number 10 is beginning to be worried that there are more MPs backing the possibility of a second referendum. That's something that could be voted on as early as Saturday this week. Then that's the Scottish Sun on Sunday there, and we've got Sunday Mail, a Scottish newspaper. Nicola Sturgeon has done a piece for quite a few Scottish newspapers, and their take on it is, Nicola, I'll take down Nat rebels, it says. The Mail on Sunday in Scotland has a story you won't see on the Mail on Sunday in England, a revolt over the SNP tax on parking at work. We'll be talking about that as well. And then there's the Sunday Telegraph, as reported in the news, Jacob Rees-Mogg in the unexpected role, unlikely role of leading moderate and hoser downer of Brexiteers. PM won't concede too much to the EU, he promises them. So lots to talk about. Sarah, great to have you here. Let's talk about the poll on the front page of the Sunday Times.
Yeah, so this is really remarkable, and this has put a real spring in the step of the SNP as their conference starts here. Both the leadership and the activists are very, very happy about this. In the Sunday Times, it's a panel-based poll, which has the first time that panel-based have put 50% of Scottish voters saying that they would prefer independence. And actually, I think the really key thing about this poll is not just that 50% figure, which we've seen a couple of recent polls, more people saying they'd vote for independence than to stay in the UK, but the really key thing...
So it's not just one poll?
No, but then again, we've seen others. The most recent poll on this had support for independence only at 45%. It fluctuates a bit, but this is a significant one, which had a lot of people ask the question. And the key thing about it is it also finds that 45% compared to 35% think Scotland would be better off economically as an independent country within the EU rather than remaining in the UK after Brexit. If that continues, that means the next argument about independence is about whether or not you want to be a separate country, despite the fact that you might take an economic hit. It means the SNP could make the argument you would be more prosperous if you were an economic country. And that completely changed
that's really
the terms of the
yes.
debate. So good news, you would think, for the SNP, and it is broadly, but there are people within the party who are impatient. They say, if these are the circumstances, let's have another referendum.
Can we explain to people, Sarah, Plan A and Plan B? Because there's a lot of talk about those two plans. What are they?
Yes, absolutely. And so here's this piece by Nicola Sturgeon that you referred to in the Mail. It's also in the Sunday Post, saying, we don't need a Plan B to win independence because Plan A is perfectly good. Plan B is what's been put around by a few activists, some MPs and MSPs, saying, look, if the Westminster government won't allow us to have another referendum on independence, let's find another route. Let's either say that if at the next election we win more than half of the parliamentary seats in Scotland, we should just start negotiations.
That's it, we're independent.
Or we'll just have our own referendum. Even if Westminster won't allow it, let's have our own referendum like they did in Catalonia and see what the outcome is. Nicola Sturgeon's making very, very clear in this piece here today that the only route towards independence is a legal and constitutional referendum, saying she is not going to fall into a unionist trap of trying to be led down the road of Plan B.
Rachel Watson, you're a political correspondent up here as well. Why do you think that Nicola Sturgeon is so adamant that she doesn't want to go down, as it were, the less conventional way of achieving independence?
I think there is for Nicola Sturgeon. Obviously, there's concerns around wanting another referendum, but also around how you get that referendum. And I think the last one, we always refer to it, was the golden standard of referendums. Everything was done legally, everyone supported it, everything was tied up with the Edinburgh Agreement. And I think, you know, that is what she would like to do.
That is proper independence as far as she's concerned.
Yes, that would give them the argument, this happened legally, this happened properly, we followed all the same routes we did last time. But as Sarah mentioned, there are people within the party who are not happy with that. They want a plan B, and they want it to happen a little bit faster than what they see Nicola Sturgeon doing at the moment. And I believe that we're going to see something happen at the conference today. I know there's a couple of people who are willing to cause a little bit of trouble, possibly.
Really? Very, very interesting. We'll stay tuned, as they say. Now, I mentioned the Mail on Sunday in Scotland, the Scottish edition. They've got a parking tax story. A lot of English viewers won't know about the parking tax, so tell us about the parking tax.
Yes, so this has been the story of the week up here, actually, this week. So the Scottish Government's transport bill went through with a Green amendment supported by the government, which gives councils across Scotland the power to bring in a workplace parking levy, which means councils now have the power for, say, businesses with 11 or more parking spaces. It looks like that could be what happens, to pay around £415 per space.
To try and stop people driving to work, presumably.
To try and stop people taking their cars into work, to get rid of kind of city centre congestion. And the Mail on Sunday today have a story that they've spoken to all 32 councils in Scotland, and the only two considering it just now are Edinburgh, which is an SNP Labour council, and Glasgow, which is an SNP council. So all the rest have said either ruled it out completely, or they say they have no plans yet.
Yeah, to do it.
To do it. So
well, very interesting, because, you know, as the green agenda comes into mainstream politics more and more, it is difficult to do. It's not easy. People think green agenda is easy and cuddly, but there's lots of voters who don't like the idea. Kate, let's talk about what's going on down in Westminster, because it's going to be a frantic week in Parliament, and a key group of people will be the Labour rebels who are thinking about voting with Boris Johnson if he brings a deal back.
This isn't particularly good news for Boris Johnson. I've got no idea whether he reads The Observer, but I think this piece really shows that he can't rely on these Labour MPs that have Leave seats. He really needs their votes because he has such a sort of shocking non-majority at the moment. So, you know, these are people like Stephen Kinnock, Gloria De Piero, Owen Smith. You know, they've said all along that they're really keen to make sure that they respect the referendum, but there are also there's deep warnings that Boris's deal is the wrong kind of deal and they can't get behind it. And Anna Turley, who's the MP for Redcar in this piece, she's saying, you know, you can't be a Labour MP and back Boris's deal because
the political worry, presumably, is you back Boris's deal, he gets it through. It's a great triumph for him, and then you supercharge Boris Johnson's election campaign and damage your own party.
Yeah,
so
they don't want to hand him victory in any way. And I think for some people it will be kind of difficult reading because some of those quotes really do spell out we're just not going to back it because it's a Boris deal. And it doesn't feel like there's much thought beyond that. But others in there are saying we don't like it because it leaves Northern Ireland in limbo and there's no guarantees on workers' rights or environmental standards.
So that's going to happen on Saturday. That's going to be a big confrontation on Saturday. Before we get there, of course, tomorrow, the Queen's speech. I feel slightly sorry for poor old Queenie. She's being dragged down to make the speech. And normally this is a new government laying out, this is what we are going to do, Sarah Smith, but it's going to be different this time, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it's buried in the inside pages. So there's a big piece here in The Observer trailing some of what's going to be in the Queen's speech. But, you know, this would normally be being briefed onto the front page of every newspaper if this was a normal Queen's speech, but it's not. These aren't normal times. And one of the other things that makes it unusual, of course, is she's reading out a Queen's speech written by a government that doesn't have a majajority. So there's absolutely no guarantee that any of the things that are being promised in this Queen's speech will actually be passed by this
My government
Parliament.
will legislate to ... But we must say, well, hold on a second, your government doesn't have a majority, so no, it won't. It will be a very strange event.
The absolutely key piece, of course, will be the withdrawal agreement bill that will be in the Queen's speech, and that will allow Brexit to happen by the 31st of October if there's a parliamentary majority for it. But that'll be there as the legal mechanism to allow it to happen.
That is the crucial thing. Let's turn to the big if, Rachel, because there's a big attack in the Mail, I think on the front page of the Mail down south. Enter Tory Brexit wreckers, because there's a group of Tories who seem determined to try to stop Boris Johnson getting the deal that he is trying so hard to get right at the moment.
Yes, so the Mail on Sunday have done a splash, a spread up here in Scotland on the Tory rebels plotting to sabotage Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, they say, and force a delay to October 31st.
So even if he gets his deal through, they still want a delay?
So even if he gets the deal, and I think that shows how difficult actually the Commons will be, and I think Theresa May saw that with her deal. You know, going to the EU and negotiating is hard enough, but even if he does manage, there's absolutely no guarantees that he's going to get this through the House of Commons, and especially when you've got people like Philip Hammond and Dominic Grieve who appear to be willing to kind of go against that. And I did see Philip Hammond defending his view on this on Twitter and said, well, actually, I voted for the withdrawal agreement 3 times, so I do want a deal through.
Yes.
But he is obviously, according to this
and
story,
clearly your relations, to call them frosty is unfair on frostiness. I mean, they're really, really cold and icy. Let's talk about the other side of the Commons again. And Keir Starmer has been speaking at a conference, because out of all of this, it is still possible that we get another referendum voted through.
It's possible. So we're looking now towards Saturday, which the Commons is sitting. It's being dubbed as Super Saturday. I'm not quite sure how we all feel about that for those who have to work Super Saturday. But Keir Starmer is talking about a second referendum, and it's possible that there might be some legislation that's drawn up where a confirmatory referendum is held on some kind of Brexit deal. And the conflict with Labour is, you know, people like Keir Starmer, Shadow Brexit Secretary, he's pushing for that very, very hard. And you don't hear so much on this from Jeremy Corbyn. So there is still the belief that there is that tension between some in the Shadow Cabinet that really want a second referendum and really want to push for it now.
And can we talk about why that might be? Because it's not just Keir Starmer. It's John McDonnell has been talking about this. Emily Thornberry has been talking about it. Tom Watson has been talking about it. Quite a lot of people at the top of the Labour Party think that if they have a general election before the Brexit thing is resolved, it becomes a Brexity general election. They can't get their messages out and so on. So therefore you should deal with it cleanly with a referendum first, yes or no. Then the Brexit issue is at last dealt with and the Commons can get back to what the Commons does.
Well, and I think that's correct. I mean, there's a lot of criticism about Labour's stance, which has been to be neutral and go through an election period without actually categorically saying where it stands on a second referendum. The Guardian had a piece with Sadiq Khan this week, the Mayor of London, and he was saying very much electorally it's completely the wrong strategy to go for. Labour needs to be bold, needs to back Remain, and it needs to push for a second referendum before an election.
And it's not just up to the Labour Party. I mean, obviously, they're the largest opposition party, but the second largest, the SNP. They're going to be talking about this at their conference here today. And the clear message from the Westminster leader today is going to be that we need a general election as soon as possible, he thinks, in order to get out of the Brexit chaos. The SNP are prepared to back Corbyn as an interim Prime Minister if that's how to get a general election, because they think they would do really well out of it.
Yes, OK, well, let's talk about the other side of the argument again, Rachel, because there's lots of Brexiteers who are concerned, watching very carefully what Boris Johnson is trying to negotiate, and DUP people, above all, Nigel Dodds seems very hostile to what's been suggested so far. Jacob Rees-Mogg is the voice of calm and peace, trying to calm everybody down.
Yes, so in the Sunday Telegraph, they have Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is kind of making a bit of appeal to Brexit voters and saying, you know, compromise might be inevitable at this point, and also Boris can be trusted. As a leaver, he can be trusted, so you've got to trust in what he does now and just go with it. You know, and I've actually spoken to a number of senior Conservatives who have had this kind of view for a while now and say, Boris is the person that can be trusted. So if he needs to get some extra time, for example, if he needs to
give him some space, give him some time.
Yeah, give him some space, give him some time, let him concede what he needs to, take the time that he needs to, he can be trusted.
Just very, very briefly before we finish, one Scottish sporting story, one other sporting story. The Scottish rugby team was faced with having their game against Japan cancelled because of this typhoon. Had that happened, they wouldn't possibly have gone through to the next round, and they were even thinking of taking legal action against the international rugby authorities. But the typhoon has left them alone enough, and the game's going to go ahead.
It's going to go ahead, so that news is a wee bit late for the papers, actually, because they're full of news about the potential legal action and the team being grounded in the hotel. They will be playing Japan, the host nation, but Scotland need to not only win that match, they need to win at least 4 tries and a bonus point to go through. So it's not a given, but at least it's being played.
And finally, Kipchoge, the great Kenyan runner, in Austria, has beaten the 2-hour marathon, which is an extraordinary moment in human sporting history, really, isn't it? We should celebrate that.
Yeah, it's been amazing, and you've picked out this really interesting
this is
picture.
fascinating. In the Telegraph, you can see how it was done, and this is why it won't count as a world record, even though it is an astonishing achievement. He's surrounded by some of the world's best runners as pacers. They've got this green laser light showing the most direct route that he followed the whole way. He was being given liquids and refreshments by cyclists coming past, so he didn't have to veer off the track. So it was a huge investment. in what people are describing as more of a scientific endeavour than a sporting achievement. But nonetheless,
I think that's a bit mean on him. Yes, that's fantastic. Thank you all very much indeed. Very, very good paper review. And so to the weather. I was in Edinburgh yesterday. It was almost completely perfect. But as we've just heard, the weather that's been really bothering Scotland has been boiling up around Japan. Over to Alina Jenkins in the weather studio.
Hello there, Andrew. Well, Typhoon Hagibis has been and gone. It's now an area of low pressure to the northeast of Japan. Things are quietening down there. Back home, we have our own area of low pressure to deal with, not nearly as intense, but it does come with not one, but two fronts. This is yesterday's rain, still with us. Another frontal system in the Irish Sea bringing more rain, and these two areas combine together through the day and push their way north and eastwards across much of England, Wales and into southern Scotland, just clipping the eastern side of Northern Ireland. Further west, a mixture of sunshine and scattered showers. Similar story for northern and western Scotland, mainly dry here, away from some showers. Quite gusty winds for a time this morning across East Anglia and South East England. Some sunshine following on behind our band of rain. That will help temperatures up to 17, maybe even 18 Celsius, just 11 or 12 where we've got the persistent rain, which will continue across northern England and eastern Scotland for a time this evening. Then it clears away, and for much of the UK, dry for a time with clear skies before more rain arrives into Northern Ireland and southern England later in the night. 5 to 10 Celsius, the overnight low. Could get closer to freezing across northern England and parts of Scotland. And then tomorrow, 2 areas of rain, a much wetter day across Northern Ireland, that just fringing parts of Wales, southwest England, and another band of rain pushing up into central southern England. Further north and east, driest with the best of the sunshine.
Back to autumn as usual. Now, one of the big questions dividing senior Labour politicians is whether they really want a general election as soon as possible or a second referendum on Brexit first. I'm joined now by Rebecca Long-Bailey, the Shadow Business Secretary, on the line from Salford. Rebecca Long-Bailey, Britain is in touching distance now of a deal. There's very warm messages coming out of Brussels and from Dublin. In those circumstances, if Boris Johnson brings back a deal to the House of Commons and therefore avoids the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, will Labour really try and vote that down?
Well, we'll wait and see what comes out of the negotiations, but reports that suggest so far that we don't think the Tories have moved too far on their deal. They won't be advocating for a customs union that will protect British manufacturing, and we're quite worried about the prospect of intense deregulation, particularly on standards such as food standards, workers' rights and environmental safeguards. But of course, when a deal comes back to Parliament, we'll assess that on its merits and then take appropriate action going forward.
Because Theresa May, after all, gave the Labour Party a lot of concessions on workers' rights, environmental rights and many other things as well. You must now regret, as a party, walking away from that and voting that down, given where we are now.
Well, that's not true. There were a number of issues with the previous withdrawal agreement and political declaration, and of course I was involved in the intense negotiations with the government to try and get some form of compromise. And we did have, you know, favourable noises in relation to workers' rights. They didn't go as far as we wanted them to, but it became clear in those negotiations that the Tories couldn't agree with themselves, let alone secure any confidence across Parliament, and it was clear that those negotiations were going to collapse and that most Tory MPs weren't going to support what the Prime Minister was going to put on the table. And it's sad that it came to that point, because now we're faced with an even worse situation between a no-deal Brexit and a damaging Brexit that could deregulate our entire economy.
And you're going to have to decide what to do. Now, as you know, there are at least 19 Labour MPs who are thinking quite seriously about voting with the government purely to stop a no-deal Brexit. If they do that, should they be punished by the Labour Party?
Well, on the basis of what's on the table so far, Boris Johnson's proposals are incredibly damaging for our economy. We'll wait and see what happens in the negotiations, and as I've said, we'll assess the deal on its merits when it finally comes before the House, if indeed it does come before the House. But if it is as it stands, then the deal on the table is incredibly damaging, and I don't understand or wouldn't urge any of our Labour MPs or indeed any MP across the House to support those measures. And equally, we have the Ben Act, which requires the Prime Minister to secure an extension in the event that he can't secure approval for a deal or a no-deal Brexit, so that future plans can be made to renegotiate a better deal with the European Union after a general election has taken place, for example.
That to be true, but nonetheless, there are these Labour MPs who think that no deal is so near and so worrying they're prepared to vote for Boris Johnson's deal if, as you say, it comes to the House of Commons. Should they have the whip withdrawn if they do that, yes or no?
It's incredibly worrying, and I understand why many colleagues will feel, you know, that they're faced with that decision. But what I'd say is that we do have a level of insurance in relation to the Ben Act if a deal doesn't pass through Parliament, or indeed it seems that Boris Johnson's veering towards no deal. He's legally bound to ask for an extension from the European Union in the event that he doesn't secure support for either of those options from Parliament. And in that situation, I think we would be faced with a general election where every party would go out and explain to their electorate what they would secure from the European Union going forward. But it's an incredibly difficult decision, but I wouldn't advocate any MP across Parliament to support a deal that could damage our living standards and the safety of our constituents, and I know that my colleagues wouldn't do that.
OK, now, you've just, as it were, fairly rehearsed Labour's position, which is have a general election, win a general election, renegotiate Brexit, and then have a referendum. But there are a lot of your senior colleagues, as you know, who think that time is so short and we are at the crunch point, and actually what we need is a referendum now. John McDonnell, the Deputy Leader, has talked about this, and many of the other colleagues. What is your view? Is there not a case for having a referendum now and getting the issue finally cleanly dealt with this autumn?
Well, of course, I think things are going to move very quickly this week, and my personal view is that we need to assess what's on the table early this week. Has Boris Johnson managed to secure a deal, and what are the merits of that deal? I think there needs to be an examination of the parliamentary arithmetic, whether there's enough support to add an amendment to...
If there was enough support, sorry to jump in, if there was enough support for a referendum, would Rebecca Long-Bailey support a referendum?
Well, I've been on a journey, I'll be honest, Andrew, in relation to a public vote or a referendum, if you like. At the start of all of this process, I was completely against a public vote. I thought it would be very divisive. However, after 3 years of drama and pantomime antics from the Tory government, and the fact that we're facing the prospect of a no deal, I think the only option that we've got now is to let the people decide, and that's what our party's position is. I know that many colleagues are of a similar opinion to me. They've been on a journey. They weren't in favour of a referendum to start off with, but now we realise that it has to be put before the people, any final deal, and they have to make the decision as to whether they're happy with that relevant deal or whether they want to remain in the European Union. Now, that's the case if we're in a general election and Labour renegotiates a deal, and equally, I think it should be the position if we're faced with a deal that's passed through the Commons by an unelected Tory Prime Minister that could potentially be damaging for our economy.
So you could attach a referendum, as it were, to Boris Johnson's deal and put it to the country then?
Yes, but as I say, it's hypothetical at this stage, and my view would be that we'd need to assess the merits of the deal if, in fact, there is a deal on the table.
Now, I quoted John McDonnell just now. Let me quote you something else that John McDonnell said. Now, I don't know these people very well, but you do. He said that he thinks that if Labour fights the next election and doesn't win it, that both he and Jeremy Corbyn would step aside at this point. And then he said that in his view, the next Labour leader must be a woman. Do you agree with that?
I think that it would be fantastic for the next Labour leader to be a woman, and we've got a whole list of amazing MPs that could vie for that position. But, you know, it's a hypothetical situation at the moment. We're fighting for a general election to elect Jeremy Corbyn as our Prime Minister, and we think that we're in touching distance of that. But, I mean, I think it's right for John to say that in the event of us losing an election, that they would stand aside. That is convention within the party. That's usually what happens.
So I have a strong suspicion that when he said a woman, he was thinking of a particular woman. He was thinking of Rebecca Long-Bailey standing as Labour leader. Would you yourself do that? Would you stand as Labour leader? Jess Phillips says she would.
Well, it's not something that I've ever thought of or am considering at this stage. I'm fighting for a Labour government and to get Jeremy Corbyn elected as our Prime Minister with our fantastic array of policies, our green industrial revolution that I myself are working on to transform our economy and to tackle the climate emergency. And I'm putting all of my effort into that. But I think when the time comes, if the time comes, we've got a whole range of fantastic MPs in the Labour Party who in the next 10, 20, 30 years would make fantastic leaders.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Thank you very much indeed. Now a look at what's coming up on BBC One at 10:30.
Far.
Also, we'll hear about the first Briton to be made a saint for 40 years.
And the £3,000 pair of shoes that allow you to walk on water.
Join us at 10:30.
No. The American. In London, the hardcore Brexiteers are watching very anxiously as they try to work out how far the Prime Minister has gone in offering new concessions to Brussels. After all, he has to sell any deal to the House of Commons. Now, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, joins me to talk about that and much else. Anne Secoulas, the American woman who was involved in the accident which led to that terrible death, has no longer got diplomatic immunity, according to the Foreign Office. Are you now going to try to extradite her back to the UK?
Well, Andrew, good morning. I think it's important to recognise that this is an incredibly tragic case, and the Foreign Secretary has been working with his American counterparts and been in touch with the US administration on this. And the fact of the matter is, right now, it very much seems that the lady in question wants to start cooperating with the discussions and obviously the investigations, and I think we should support that.
As Home Secretary, do you think she should be extradited here to face the music?
Well, I think, look, there are discussions taking place right now, and we need to ensure that justice is done, but obviously that cooperation with this investigation takes place. That is absolutely right. I mean, we owe that to the families, and obviously this is a terribly tragic case. The family need to have the assurance, obviously, that the investigation will be thorough, will take place, and that cooperation will also take place. And obviously that's what we are committed to working to achieve.
You seem to be suggesting, Home Secretary, that these investigations could take place in America without Anne Secoulas coming to the UK. Is that the case?
No, I've been very clear, as has the government and the Foreign Secretary, that we want her to cooperate. And I think it is right that actually at this stage now, because things have moved on in the last few hours, the last 24 hours, that the family are supported. Obviously, this is a tragic case, but that the cooperation takes place. So it is right that justice is served, that the investigation takes place, and the lady, Anna Secoulas, actually does cooperate with the investigation. That is the right thing to do.
Well, let's turn then to Brexit. Are MPs going to be voting on Saturday for a deal?
Well, we've got an interesting week ahead. Obviously, this is the week in the run-up to the European Council, where there are a range of negotiations that are taking place even as we speak right now. And the reality is, obviously, the government's #1 priority is to secure a deal and obviously then bring forward the legislation in Parliament through votes and a legislative framework through a potential withdrawal agreement bill so that we can get Brexit done. And that is, of course, the government's priority.
I don't know if you could hear Rebecca Long-Bailey from the Labour Party talking a moment ago, but it was quite clear that Labour are thinking about attaching the need for a referendum, and a referendum quite soon, to this deal. So they passed the deal through, but then there's a people's vote attached to that. What would the government's attitude be? Would you give, as it were, the opposition another referendum to get that deal through?
Well, I think, let's be clear, Andrew, there is a lot of speculation that's taking place right now. The Labour Party, along with the rest of the country, the media, don't even know the details of this deal. There are negotiations that are taking place. And I think it's important to recognise as well, this negotiation has moved on quite substantially over the last few weeks. 3 months ago, we were told that the withdrawal agreement would not be reopened, and progress has been made by the Prime Minister. And so this is a negotiation. And as for the Labour Party's position, that they would vote against the deal when they haven't even seen the deal take place, well, they are clearly playing politics. That's not in the national interest. The British public want to ensure that we get Brexit done. They want to move on to all the big people's priorities, all the other domestic issues. And actually, it's pretty it's undemocratic for the Labour Party even to now start saying that they want a second referendum, where many of them, in fact, all of us, were voted to Parliament to get Brexit done and to effectively make sure that we can deliver on the referendum mandate.
I guess a lot of people would say a referendum is inherently democratic, therefore it can't be undemocratic. But let me ask you
Andrew,
about another aspect of this. OK, things have moved on, and you said we don't know the details of the deal, and that is absolutely right. But what we do know is the broad shape of the deal, because it's been discussed in Dublin and Brussels and indeed in London. Can I ask you, as a leading Brexit figure, would you be happy with Northern Ireland being treated differently, being closer to the EU customs system than the rest of Britain moving forward?
Well, I've been clear. In fact, that was rejected through the House of Commons, through the withdrawal agreement 3 times. And the fact of the matter is we should not have that difference at all. But the reality is right now, Andrew, I come back to where we are in the negotiations. There is no point speculating on, what could be acceptable, what isn't acceptable, which is exactly the position of the Labour Party, although they seem to be prejudging a deal that could come back to Parliament next week. We have to wait and see and ensure that we absolutely get the right deal for our country and vote that through, get Brexit done. But there are a couple of other points here as well. I come back to the point.
Priti Patel's red lines are.
I come back to the point that the withdrawal agreement was voted against 3 times in Parliament. The backstop, of course, is undemocratic. And secondly, as well, the EU said that they would not open up the withdrawal agreement. Progress has been made on that. And now, of course, the negotiations are now based upon discussing alternative arrangements.
OK. Trying to look forward, not back. I'm trying to find out where Priti Patel's red lines are. Nigel Dodds has said about this deal, which sounds quite like Theresa May's new customs arrangement, or new customs partnership, she called it. It cannot work because Northern Ireland has to remain fully part of the UK customs union. Presumably you agree with that.
Well, I've been clear previously, as has the government. But look, it's no point commenting on what people are saying in their individual views and positions right now. There is a negotiation that's taking place, Andrew. And, of course, as a member of the Cabinet, we'll be briefed on those negotiations, not just later today, but we will see what happens over the next week as well. The withdrawal agreement was rejected in Parliament 3 times on the basis of the backstop and on the basis that Northern Ireland obviously would be treated differently. That is a situation that is unacceptable. And quite frankly, we have to make progress now in this negotiation over the next week and be prepared for whatever outcome. And I think it's worth reminding yourself and others...
must be treated the same as the rest of the UK.
Well, Northern Ireland, we have to ensure will leave the customs union along with the rest of the United Kingdom. And that is effectively, the position that we have made clear. The Prime Minister has made that clear, as has the whole of government.
Okay. You're reading out very carefully the Prime Minister's words there, I noticed. Can I ask you about the dangers of no deal? There's been a lot of talk in the papers today about briefings about the resumption of terrorist violence in Northern Ireland if there is no deal. Have you, as Home Secretary, had any such briefings yourself?
Well, as Home Secretary and along with the entire government, we have been stepping up our planning and preparedness, obviously, for no deal. That is the right thing to do and the responsible thing to do. Specifically to your question, of course, we are absolutely well aware of security implications, and you will also know from our previous discussions on your show, when it comes to security tools and security cooperation, there are many measures that are being put in place right now in preparedness for no deal. And quite frankly, those include a range of security tools that we've been working on. But I think specifically to Northern Ireland and obviously to many of the issues that you've just referred to, we're very conscious and we're working with all organisations, agencies to ensure that we remain safe. And that is the priority of the country, of the government, to keep our country safe and our people and communities safe.
If you're putting in place new security arrangements, that can only mean that you fear the resumption of terrorist violence in the case of no deal.
No, that's not the case at all. Our security arrangements will be based on, and this comes back to the preparedness for no deal, they'll be based upon the type of tools, the type of shared intelligence forums and the data sharing platforms that we currently have. But again, looking at alternative arrangements in which we can share that intelligence and information and data. That is something that has been taken place. We've been working on that over the last 3 months. I've mentioned this previously, because the job of the government is to keep our people, communities and our country safe. And, of course, that's my focus, and that's the focus of the government.
Sure. Let me ask about going forward again. We're going to negotiate some kind of free trade arrangement with the EU afterwards. That is something that presumably requires Britain to have a different regulatory and tax regime from the EU. Otherwise, there's no point. Can you just tell us what your vision is for regulation and tax as we leave the EU?
Well, I think it's important, and this is all subject to future arrangements and future negotiations as well. So, you know, this isn't just about giving visions. We have been clear that we want a best-in-class free trade agreement. And, of course, that gives us the opportunity, Britain post-Brexit, to work with the rest of the world, to engage with the rest of the world when it comes to trade and economic opportunities in a way in which we simply have not been able to do so thus far. That is obviously the aim and objective, the aspiration of the government, and the negotiations this week we hope will pave the way forward once we secure a deal to have that economic relationship with the rest of the world. And of course that means looking to agree a future trading arrangement, not just with the European Union, but obviously new trading opportunities and agreements with the rest of the world, countries outside of the European Union.
The government's own modelling suggests that this FTA would result in a lower growth of 6.7%. Is that something that you're prepared to accept as a price worth paying?
Well, I don't accept that, and, you know, I don't know which data you're quoted.
It's your own government's figures.
Well, Andrew, there's been a range of information that has been put out in the media over recent weeks and months, much of which I should say is out of date. And as someone that sits on a cabinet committee every single day, where we're looking at the preparations for Britain post-Brexit, preparing for a no deal as well. You know, we have every confidence in our economy and our businesses, but also in terms of our future prospects post-Brexit.
OK, let's hear from those businesses directly then, because a whole bunch of them, and I'll read them out. The Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the people that make and sell cars, the Chemical Industries Association, the Food and Drink Federation, the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and the Aerospace Trade Industry Body. A lot of people who are actually at the forefront of trying to make this country earn its place in the world sent a letter to the government, which I will now read out part of to you, and they said that this proposal is a serious risk to manufacturing competitiveness and will result in huge new costs and disruption to UK firms. I can't see why you're laughing. It's got the potential to risk consumer and food safety and confidence, access to overseas market for UK exporters, and vital future investment in innovation in this country. That is a really serious challenge to this plan, is it not?
Well, this is why the government has been working assiduously with businesses as well, I should say, across a range of sectors when it comes to planning for our exit from the European Union. That is vital, that's very important, and many of those organisations, Andrew, that you yourself have listed have been part of those discussions and, you know, have been working with the government as well. So, you know, I do take issue with the way in which you phrase that, because as a government we have a duty to work with those sectors, with those organisations, and we're doing that. But I think I should emphasise something else. In terms of the planning and preparedness to leave with a deal, obviously we're working assiduously to get that right now through negotiations. But as part of our no-deal planning and preparedness, the preparations through cabinet committees and obviously through other government departments, those key departments, including the Treasury and including the Department of Business, have been working with those industries and with those sectors, not just to give them assurances, but to work alongside them through any challenges that they may be foreseeing to ensure that actually we can deliver the right economic outcomes when Britain leaves the European Union.
All right. OK. As Home Secretary, you've already said that a post-Brexit England would be pursuing different regulations and different tax regimes to the EU. If Scotland was independent and inside the EU, would there need to be a hard border between England and Scotland?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment or even speculate about what will happen with regards to Scotland. The government right now is focused just solely on the next week ahead in terms of negotiating a deal with the European Union. That is obviously our #1 priority. And I think, actually, you know, I've heard the stories already in the press from where you are as well about a second referendum. I think, quite frankly, the British public want to, when it comes to referendums, respect the results of the referendums that took place previously, whether it's in Scotland and whether it's on the Brexit referendum and our exit of the European Union. And that, of course, is what our focus is on right now, which is delivering the referendum mandate with our exit for the EU and getting on with the job. Tomorrow you will see a Queen's speech being announced, 22 new bills, working on the people's priorities. These are the type of issues that absolutely matter to the British public. And it's important, I think, for both Parliament and, in fact, for the British public to see their Parliament now delivering on their priorities and getting the job of Brexit done.
All right, Priti Patel, Home Secretary, thanks very much indeed for listening to us. Listening to that was Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister and leader of the SNP. Welcome, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much.
We've been talking all morning about this potential New Deal. 50-50 chance, but there's hopes growing in Brussels and in Dublin that we are now finally in touching position of a deal. Would the SNP really vote that down and destroy it in the House of Commons?
Well, look, the proposals that are on the table from Boris Johnson and any likely amendment of them would not be acceptable to the SNP. They would take Scotland out of the EU, out of the single market, out of the customs union, with all the damage that would do, and against our will. And it's very clear that Boris Johnson envisages a much looser relationship in future with the EU than even Theresa May did. I mean, you don't hear Boris Johnson talk about protecting environmental rights or consumer rights or workers' rights. So we would be looking at a race to the bottom where priorities would be to try to get trade deals with the likes of Donald Trump. That's not acceptable to the SNP.
At the moment, the choice seems to be a deal or no deal.
That's not the choice,
this
Andrew.
is the deal.
That's not the choice.
Well, eventually it's going to be. There's either a deal or there isn't a deal.
Well, we have to work through these things, but if you fast forward to next weekend, that's not the choice. The Benn Act is the law of the land that says if there is no deal, there has to be a request for an extension.
So there'll have to be a deal next year or whenever the Benn Act runs out. Eventually there'll have to be a deal.
And
it sounds like you're against any deal.
Well, I'm not sure I'm giving you an exclusive here by saying I'm against Brexit.
Yes,
Scotland voted against Brexit. So I don't think that is the choice now or even in the future. If there is an extension, that opens the door to a general election. It opens the door even to a second referendum. I don't think, and I certainly am not prepared as First Minister of Scotland to accept the inevitability of Brexit.
OK, well, you said let's fast forward to Saturday. So let's fast forward to Saturday. I don't know if you heard of Rebecca Long-Bailey, but she was suggesting that if a second referendum was attached to any possible deal by Boris Johnson, that might be an acceptable thing. If a referendum is part of this, would the SNP then vote for it?
Well, look, I'm not going to speculate before we know what the actual choices will be next Saturday. We will not vote for a deal of the kind described by Boris Johnson. I've set out, I think it was on...
Deal plus referendum?
Well, let me just try and unpack this and answer your question in detail and in all the different aspects of it. I think it was on this programme last year at the SNP conference, I said the SNP would back a second EU referendum, and that remains our position. But there is a question of the right and proper and frankly most deliverable sequence of events now. Over the past few weeks I have been of the view, and I'm still of the view, that the better sequence of events, in principle and for practical reasons, is for the opposition to try to get rid of Boris Johnson in a vote of confidence, to have the extension secured, and then have a general election as quickly as possible. Now, that remains my view, but I've also said we rule nothing out.
But you're open to... I mean, if there was
I'm open to anything.
So-called people's vote on the floor of the House of Commons, you'd be open to it, SNP
I've very
voting
deliberately tried not to close down options. This Brexit fiasco is in such a mess. The implications and the consequences are so potentially damaging that I think any responsible leader wanting to do the right thing for the people they represent would keep all options open. But I've equally tried to have the SNP try to lead and to guide the best ways forward. One of the practical issues I think there is about having a referendum before a general election, we've seen how difficult it has been, thus far impossible, for the opposition to come together to unite behind a leader of an interim government that might be in office for a few days to secure an extension. If there is to be a government that legislates for a referendum, it has to be in office for a reasonable period of time, so it has to do other things. It has to govern, it might have to put through a budget. I just question whether it would be possible. I question whether it would be possible for the opposition to come together, which is why I think an election where parties can seek a mandate for a second referendum is the better option. But I'm ruling nothing out because the circumstances we're in is such that we have to keep all options open.
That's interesting. Going ahead, there are two obvious possible outcomes. Outcome one, Boris Johnson either gets his deal through or brings us out without a deal at some point. I understand about the Benn Act, but at some point.
I don't think those are the only two options.
Well, let's say option one is what he would regard, and that part of the world would regard, as a proper Brexit. We leave the EU. England, certainly, in its economy, diverges in terms of regulations and in taxes. The SNP running Scotland would be in a very difficult position for a few years at least, where you would be part of Brexit Britain. How would you cope with that?
Well, firstly, and I don't want to overly labour this point, but I don't think the two options you've described are the only two options. The reason I am so determined to do everything I can to stop Brexit is because I think what you've just described there is damaging not just for Scotland but for the rest of the UK.
It may be damaging, but it's plausible.
But
I'm just
it is
looking at a
plausible.
plausible future. How do you deal with it?
To answer that question, well, I think Scotland, in these circumstances, the argument for Scotland becoming independent is even stronger than it has been previously, so that we can decide our own relationship with the European Union. I would want us to be members of the European Union, continue to be in the single market and the customs union, and actually have a better foundation to build economic success than we would have coming out of the EU. And we see today a poll in the Sunday Times shows that support for independence is rising, and people actually think that option, an independent Scotland in the EU, would lead to us being more prosperous than the alternative.
Absolutely. As you work towards the referendum, fight the referendum campaign, and then try to return to the EU as an independent country, that process takes quite a few years. In that period, you would not be able to stop Britain diverging radically from where we are in terms of regulations and taxes and so on.
Which is the real danger, which is why, A, I will fight so hard against that option, and B, why I will make the case for Scotland not to allow itself to be trapped in that kind of situation, but instead to chart our own course as an independent country. I don't underestimate the dangers and the damage of a Boris Johnson-led government in a race to the bottom, prioritising trade deals with the likes of Donald Trump, which is why I would like to see a vote of confidence to get him out of office in a general election that could hopefully see a different future.
How long do you think it would take an independent Scotland to get back into the EU?
Not very long. I'm not going to sit here and put a timescale on that, because we would have to properly, responsibly, in a mature way, have these discussions. But I speak to people in the European institutions and other member states regularly as part of my job as First Minister. I think there is a real appetite to see Scotland in the EU. I think there would be open arms for Scotland, and I don't think that is a process that would, of necessity, take a particularly long period of time. Of course, there would be options for Scotland in the interim in terms of EFTA and being in the single market. So, we have options there to put the interests of our country first. At the moment, our future is being dictated to us by a Westminster Tory government that we didn't vote for.
Scotland has a 7% deficit, one of the worst, if not the worst, in Europe. Is that going to be a problem in those negotiations?
Scotland's deficit is reducing. We saw in the most recent figures published, our onshore revenues in particular are rising faster than other parts of the UK. Scotland's economy is sound, strong, healthy. The biggest risk to Scotland's economy right now is a Brexit future. And, imagine an independent...
Let me ask you about another thing directly related to that. If England leaves the EU and pursues a different course in terms of tax and regulations and so on, which is the only reason for leaving the EU and therefore seems to be likely under the Conservatives, then you will have a very different regime south of the border and north of the border, and I don't see how you can avoid a serious border.
Well, look, I don't want borders. It's not my choice. But again, we have to take these things step by step. I am not the author of the Brexit policy. I'm opposed to the Brexit policy. It is not my choice to have policies that result in borders. I don't want Scotland, and I don't see why Scotland does have to choose.
But you have to deal with the world that's foisted on you, in a sense.
And I will, but what I'm not going to do is to try to speculate and answer questions on the basis of detail that we don't yet have and a scenario that we don't yet know the nature of. So I will always be frank and honest with people in Scotland about the choices I'm asking them to make. One of the things I am determined about is that the choice that Scotland will make on independence, just as it was in 2014, to be fair, will be an informed and a detailed one. We won't plaster lies on the side of a bus and cross our fingers and hope we get away with it.
If we're going to be frank and honest, if England leaves the EU and pursues a different course, and Scotland stays inside the EU and wants to pursue that course, then there has to be a border between Scotland and England. That is kind of obvious.
Question, and
let's be frank about it.
I understand why, but that question had a number of ifs in it, and that's the point I am making. We need to see how things play out over and what the final relationship between the UK and the EU will be. I am not of the view that what you've described, what Boris Johnson wants, is an inevitability, and I will continue to argue against that. But as that picture clarifies, I will be honest with the people of Scotland, but that opens a situation where Scotland's best interests depend on being independent and in charge of our own future. And I don't want borders. It is not my policies that are putting borders anywhere.
You need that new referendum. Why haven't you asked for a Section 30 order?
Because I'm putting legislation through the Scottish Parliament right now to put the rules and regulations in place. I've said as recently as a few weeks ago that as that legislation progresses, we will make that request for a Section 30 order. We see rising support for independence. We see rising support.
Can I ask, will you be asking for that order this year?
Yes.
You're asking for that order next month?
We will do it at an appropriate moment when the legislation is passing. It is likely to be over the next matter of weeks. It is coming soon. Of course, we don't yet know who is likely to be in Downing Street. The situation is very fluid, and that's why I've taken the decision to do the preparations that are within our control here right now, and we're getting on with that.
So what quite a lot of your own supporters don't understand is because under this process, a Conservative government could refuse to allow you to run a referendum. Why don't you go for the so-called Plan B and say that if we win a big majority at the next election, or we will carry out our own informal referendum, that will be enough? What's the problem with it?
Because the process we undertake to choose our own future has to be capable of delivering independence. Now, I've campaigned for independence all my life. If I thought there was a quicker way, an easier way, a Plan B that would get us there quicker, I would have taken it by now.
So what is the problem?
What we have to do is have a process that, firstly, allows us to demonstrate there is majority support in Scotland for independence. And secondly, we have to have a process that is legal and accepted. Otherwise, our independence will not be recognised, not just domestically in the UK,
Catalan problem,
but across. Well, Catalonia and our friends in Catalonia do demonstrate that you can have a referendum but not necessarily become independent. I'm in the business of seeing Scotland become independent. Now, it would be easy for me, and it would make my life easier in the short term, just to tell my supporters what they want to hear. But I've watched Brexiteer leaders doing that over the past 3 years, and it doesn't end well. I have to deal in reality. I'm determined to lead my country to independence, and that means doing it properly.
You've talked a lot about an election. Now, in that election, looking at the polls, it's very, very hard to tell what's going to happen. But one very, very plausible scenario is that Labour is the largest party but doesn't have an overall majority and has to look to other parties in order to be able to govern. Now, are you still in a position where you would not go into any kind of coalition with Labour? So you do a supply and support. You might do a supply and support arrangement.
We will not put the Tories into office. I don't favour coalitions. I'll say the same as I said in 2015 and 2017. We would favour a progressive-type alliance. But I say this to Jeremy Corbyn or any Westminster leader who's looking to the SNP for support. If you don't accept Scotland's right to choose our own future at a time of our own choosing, don't even bother picking up the phone to me.
All right. Another referendum campaign, therefore, coming along. In an ideal world, would it be better to have Alex Salmond shoulder to shoulder campaigning along with you?
I want everybody who supports independence campaigning for independence. I think we're closer to it than ever before. I know what you're trying to do here. I'm not going to get drawn into the Alex Salmond
I'm not going to get involved into trials or anything like that. I'm just asking, would it be better for the independence movement to have him there?
I want everybody who supports independence campaigning hard for it, and I believe we are as closer than we've ever been before to achieving that.
If you are in the position of being able to support or not support a Jeremy Corbyn government, people are going to want to know what your attitude is to some of their more radical policies. The 10% coming from company accounts to their workers, for instance, Scottish companies would have to be passing over 10% of their wealth to their own workers. It's a radical policy supported by a lot of people. What's the SNP's view?
We'll judge policies on their merit. The point about... Well, look, I will look at the detail of it. I've not seen all of the detail of these policies, and I think we would want to judge that.
I'm going to give you one more, which is very easy to understand.
Andrew, before you do, let me say, I listened to Jeremy Corbyn at his recent conference, and most of the policies he was proposing, abolishing prescription charges, abolishing tuition fees, free personal care for the elderly, the SNP has already done all of these things in Scotland, so we're actually leading the way when it comes to progressive policies, and Labour have clearly got a lot to learn.
They want to squeeze out private schools from Britain entirely. You've got lots of private schools in Scotland. Would you favour that?
We're already, in terms of business rates exemptions, we're already removing that from private schools here. So, again, on some of these things, we're ahead of the game. Now, Labour's announced a lot of things in headline terms. I don't know what all of the detail is. I've already said I don't envisage coalitions in the kind of arrangement where we're supporting anybody. We'll look at the merit of policies, and we will always act in what we think is in the best interests of the people of Scotland.
One of your erstwhile supporters, Robin McAlpine of the think tank Commonweal, has been very, very critical of how you run things in Scotland. He says there's no meaningful cabinet government, internal dissent is not accepted, and the administration has been built mainly around the personality of the leader. If you criticise, you're out. Without a serious policy unit or proper links to the Scottish public policy community, the vacuum has been filled by the requests of lobbyists. That's a very serious and grave charge against your administration.
It's also a big pile of nonsense. You know, I mean, speak to anybody in my cabinet. We have healthy, vibrant, strong cabinet government in Scotland. I actually have a very strong policy unit. I set it up when I became First Minister. There wasn't a policy unit in the Scottish Government before that. We are introducing progressive, groundbreaking policies almost every week in Scotland right now. And as I've said, you know, we've got a Labour leader south of the border that thinks these policies are so great that they form the backbone of their own manifesto. And, you know, after, nearly 13 years in government, the SNP enjoys opinion poll leads, and opinion polls are not everything, over our opponents that most other parties would love to have. So, you know, I appreciate that government is always about having people scrutinising and criticising. That's right, proper, it's in the nature of things. But the SNP is in a pretty strong position, and we're about to open our conference with a real spring in our steps.
Nicola Sturgeon, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us today. That's all from us in Aberdeen. I'll be back in London next Sunday when there should be plenty more to talk about. Good morning.
Seven extraordinary continents. Each one full of life. 7 worlds, 1 planet, coming soon on BBC One and BBC iPlayer.
Could we talk about the fact that we killed a man? Why would we want to do that?
A cover-up that will trigger consequences 2 brothers won't see coming. A brand new 4-part drama.
I feel like I'm going to cry.
Guilt, coming soon to BBC Two and BBC iPlayer.
Now on BBC One HD, Sunday Politics comes from London. For your region, switch to BBC One.
Hello and thanks for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Glinker and you're watching Sunday Politics London.